Thank you for joining the Ohio State University Leadership Center for this complimentary workshop. We are going to be recording this session in order to share it widely on our YouTube channel. We will be sending you a link after this recording after the webinar today. As you have questions, please leave them in the chat box and Emma Newell will ask them on your behalf at the end of the session. At this time, I am honored to introduce to you our new chair of the Department of Agricultural Communication, Education, and Leadership at The Ohio State University, Dr. Shannon Washburn. The Leadership Center team has decided to ask Dr. Washburn to moderate this panel as a way of our introducing you to him. So welcome everybody, and Shannon, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Beth. It is a pleasure for me to have this opportunity as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Leadership Center. And so we're so thrilled to have our panelists joining us today and over 650 participants who are registered. So for those of you who are wondering why you can't turn your video on, we have the webinar set up so that you can only see video of panel members. Since we do have over 650 people registered, those would be very small thumbnails. So as I think about beginning a new role in a new workplace, culture is such an important topic on my mind just about every day, and thinking about ways that I can foster a positive, inclusive, equitable culture is a key priority for me as a new supervisor in a workplace that is new to me. And so that's why I feel like right now, personally, this is a subject that is very important to me. But as our nation continues to struggle decade after decade with race relations, and as we see racial tensions becoming a front of mind situation for most Americans, this is an incredibly important topic for us to address today. And I thank you, panelists and participants, for joining in on this conversation. I don't want this session to be about me, so I'm going to stop talking and ask our panelists to introduce themselves and then share an example that they would like to share, either about a time or a place where they have witnessed the need for our ongoing work in this important area, or a situation where in the workplace, maybe they have seen a positive transition or cultural shift that has been a result of intentional work in this area. So Nicole Nieto, if you will introduce yourself and address one of those two questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Shannon, and to the organizers. It's wonderful to be here today. My name's Nicole Nieto. I'm the Assistant Vice Provost in the Office of Outreach and Engagement here at Ohio State. And for me, when I think about how I've seen this work really make an impact, is through the work that I've been involved with dialogue, specifically a program called Intergroup Dialogue, that really gives individuals the tools and the confidence to be able to have what we often call difficult conversations, but what I'd like to call important conversations that we need to be having. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Yolanda Zepeda, could you please introduce yourself as well?
Thank you, Dr. Washburn. I'm Yolanda Zepeda, and I'm Assistant Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion here at Ohio State. And so I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I think it's important that we acknowledge where we are. And so I want to say a word about why it's important that we continue doing this work. And I'll start with actually a great story. Ohio State, we're celebrating our sesquicentennial, 150 years. And if you look at the period, the first 100 years of our existence as a university, we awarded the doctoral degree in the physical and life sciences to more African Americans than any other university in the country. So that period, during the first 100 years, we were at the top. In the mid 70s, we were the #1 producer of Black PhDs in any field. We were ahead of Columbia and New York, who were second and third. Finally, our office, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. We were one of the first universities to establish an office of this kind, and it actually was created because of the efforts, the organizing, and the protests of Black students and faculty 50 years ago. So that's all terrific, great accomplishment. We should be way ahead of the game because back then we were way ahead of the field. But about 15 years ago, we saw a precipitous drop in our student enrollments, and we have continued to struggle with African-American student enrollments since then. And if you look at our faculty, we have a lot of room to grow. We had 121 Black faculty, tenure-track faculty 10 years ago, and this autumn we had 121 Black faculty. So we know that we can educate top talent, and we have all the tools to recruit top talent, but we need to do a much better job of reaching into those communities. And that's going to take the work of all of us. So thank you to everyone who's here today. I hope that we can do some good work together.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Leo Taylor, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be here and have this discussion. My role within OSU is in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, where I serve as the program manager for faculty and staff affairs. And in that role, I provide professional development and training opportunities, webinars, workshops, and so forth for faculty and staff as well as students. And I'm having these conversations all the time. So when I was pondering this question about why do this work, or what examples have I seen that have been encouraging, is really difficult for me to pinpoint one, because I've had so many conversations over the past 2 years with folks who've had eye-opening experiences in one of the programs, who've implemented changes just by having conversations in the workplace, conversations at home, really just starting to think about these issues. One thing that really did stand out to me though recently was becoming aware of potential opportunities for implicit bias to impact the grant review process for student grant applications for CFAES for their grant program. And I met with the office who handles the grants, and they were very open to identifying ways to minimize the impact of implicit bias. So for example, we know that when people whiten their resumes, a Black candidate that whitens a resume to remove any indicators that they're Black, they are 2.5 times more likely to get a callback for a job interview. So if we can take measures to remove any kind of triggers for bias, we can create a more equitable system where grants can be distributed based on actual merit. So they were very interested in implementing new strategies to minimize or mitigate the impact of bias, and that was very encouraging.
Leo, thank you for addressing both the need for the system to change and the individual to change. Both are critically important. Cliff Greer, please tell us a bit about yourself.
Good morning. My name is Cliff Greer. I'm a 2007 graduate from the College of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering College. My degree was in construction systems management. I'm currently in Naples, Florida, and I actually moved there right when I graduated. Worked for Craft Construction, what at that time was the largest private construction firm in the state. I was recruited to work down there at the recruiting fair on campus. So currently I've moved over to education. So I'm now the director of the Engineering Academy at Naples High School in Naples, Florida, and I'm also an assistant football coach here on campus. I'm really excited that we're having this conversation. It's funny, I really like what Leo just said about whitening your resume. I've done that before, just kind of knowing where I'm going and where I'm applying to. So in my area where I am in Naples, has the largest collection of Ohio State alumni outside of Columbus, Ohio. So, you know, pretty cool place to be, but it is not the most diverse place in the country. And really, two situations that really come to mind here. I'm a father of 3 young kids, 2 young boys. One's in 1st grade, one's in kindergarten, and a little girl who's six months old. My 5-year-old twice has kind of already encountered a little bit of bias Kind of shocking. It wasn't anything that was super out there or super, advertent, but in preschool, one of his friends from school told him that his sister said that he wasn't allowed to play with brown boys. So that was one. And then the second one in kindergarten, a couple weeks ago, a kid in class kept telling him that he was dirty. And he's like, why am I dirty? Like, you're dirty, your skin's dirty. Because, he was talking about the actual color or skin tone. So, I agree with what everybody was saying in the beginning, where we have a lot of work to do. I have a lot of other examples that I won't really get into right now, because I don't want to take up the whole time. But I will say that I agree when you say we have a lot of work to do all the way around.
Cliff, thank you so much. Joyce Chen, our final panelist, please introduce yourself.
Thanks for inviting me to join the panel. I'm an associate professor in agricultural, environmental, and development economics, and my research is mostly on climate change and migration in South Asia. I'm also the chair-elect for the President and Provost Council on Women here at Ohio State. And I've been pleased to see, and it's been great to watch kind of the evolution among friends and colleagues just over the last few months of people who are willing to come to the table to educate themselves about these topics. And what I've been really pleased to see is how they've been able to shift just over the last few months from centering themselves in these experiences and how they feel, or how, being called out on a bias or a negatively charged event makes them feel, versus the impact of their actions and their reactions on other people. So that gives me a lot of hope for continued progress.
Thank you, Joyce. And the next question, I'm just going to ask each panel member to respond to this introductory question, and then we'll get into some more specific ones and go to questions from our participants as well. But why is it important to talk about race in the workplace? Can we start there? Yolanda, would you mind sharing your thoughts?
Thank you. That's a great question. Here at Ohio State, we have, and I'll use that as an example, we have a small proportion of our staff and faculty who are coming from underrepresented backgrounds, African-American backgrounds, if we're talking specifically about race. And we cannot put the burden, the work of educating everyone about their experiences on them. So if we're going to, I mentioned before the statistics, if we're going to change those patterns where we're recognizing and welcoming talent, and we're providing infrastructures, programs, policies that are supportive, not only of our faculty, but our staff and our students, that means everyone needs to learn how to be supportive, and needs to be much more, reflective about the impact that they're having, not only in the things that they say and do, but the way that we structure, the way that we choose what we value, where are we investing in programs, where are we valuing certain kinds of scholarship, where are we valuing certain kinds of pedagogies and research methodologies. I believe, who was it that talked about Leo talked about the applications for grants. We bring all of our biases to bear, and they're not intentional. We can't know all of these things unless we take specific steps to learn about them. So yeah, it's the work, it's the responsibility of all of us to really understand how we are serving broadly all of our constituents. So and it's going to take a lot of listening.
Sorry about that. Leo, would you mind sharing from your perspective, why is it important to talk about race in the workplace?
I thought I saw you mouth my name. Good at lip reading. Yeah, I'll be brief. My philosophy is, if we're not talking about and thinking about race, we will blind ourselves to the effects of racism. This gets also to the color blindness idea. If we are not identifying people's racial identities, we will be blinded to their experiences as Black people, as people of color. And we will be blinded to the impact of racism on those folks. So in my journey as becoming an anti-racist, I have realized I have a lot of work to do as a white person who hasn't had a strong racial identity, because whiteness is the norm in this society. So I have to do a lot of thinking about it, a lot of talking about it, just to make sure that my implicit biases are in check. And at work, there are numerous opportunities for bias to interfere and create inequity. So, so yes, to keep us on our toes, essentially.
Thank you, Leo. Cliff, I'm going to turn to you next, and you're the one member of our panel who does not work in a university environment. You work in a for-profit environment. From that perspective or others, why is it important from your point of view?
You know, I would say that, you know, which one is that, you know, it may sound kind of corny, but, you know, people don't know what they don't know. And, you know, and I think that kind of goes in agreement with a couple of my fellow panelists have said. You know, your background shapes and molds your biases, you know, your experiences shape and mold your upbringing, you know, but then when you meet somebody else from a different walk of life, their experiences are going to be different. You know, the example I use is my roommate my freshman year in college, at Ohio State. We lived in Morrill Tower. He grew up on a farm. I'd never been to a farm before. I didn't even know that part of Ohio existed. And then he was the opposite. So, you know, he never locked his doors, never rolled his windows up in his car. He didn't, because he never had to worry about any of that stuff. So, you know, it's a learning experience for both of us where I kind of had to educate him, like, hey man, we're in the city now. You gotta be a little more careful. And then he, you know, him kind of telling me, you know, how he grew up and how things were and some of the things you got to do in the morning and the evening and the afternoon, where it's just a different lifestyle. And neither one was right or wrong or good or bad, but it's always good to learn from each other. And that's really why it's so important to have those conversations while you're at work, whether it will be where, you know, when I was an engineer for the construction firm, or as a teacher, you know, and as a teacher, you have to be careful of what you expose your students to. But as far as with the faculty and the conversations you have, it's kind of that same thing where, you know, people don't know what they don't know. So that's why it's really important to have those conversations and discussions amongst each other.
Thank you so much. Joyce, what is your point of view on this question?
I agree, of course, with everything the other panelists have been saying. I think it also goes to the fact of recognizing how systemic racism invades our institutions, right, and the policies that we have in place. Not just the role of our implicit biases, but as a friend of mine put it, you know, we're sort of all in a fishbowl, right? We breathe the water that we're swimming in, and we've all lived in this water all our lives. And even I oftentimes, right, find every day, really find new ways. I think, oh, that actually is a racist policy, right? That has some disparate impact that I never realized before. And so I think just, you know, continuing those conversations allows us to see how systems are working against groups and folks as well.
Thank you. Last but not least, Nicole.
So I really feel we can't not talk about race, right? When we look at the historical context of the United States, when we look at what so many people are experiencing today, still, this is something we can't not do. And I think one of the mistakes that people often make is that they see it as another thing to check off the box, right? Okay, we've talked about race. We've talked about race in our workplace. Check, right? And we can't see it that way. We can't see it as something to check off and say, okay, we've done what we're supposed to do. We need to see it as we're doing what is the right thing to do, what we have to do, right? The other piece, I think, we've seen our country become more racially diverse. When we look at K through 12 education and the diversity among students, the racial diversity among students, and then we look at who's teaching and who's leading and who our leaders are in private corporations and in universities, it's not representative. And so we must address that. And finally, when I speak with students at Ohio State, one of the things that they're seeking out from employers are companies that are diverse and that value inclusion and diversity. And I've had students tell me, oh, I won't even go look for a job there because they don't value diversity. This is what students are saying. So students, the younger generations that will be seeking employment in the coming years, they expect this, right? So this is really important.
Can I make a comment on what you said? I think that's a good point. And I think with my generation, that wasn't always the case. We were brought up to say, okay, if you go to school or if you don't go to school, whenever you're done with your schooling, you go find a job. And none of that criteria was anything that we were ever really taught about. Where I think with everything that's going on right now, just like she just said, with our next generation, this is going to be different. And I think this is a good chance for the next generation to hold employers accountable for all those things that she just spoke of, because I think it's going to be very important.
And if I can just add, Cliff, that's right. The employees are asking for that, but now increasingly our employers are demanding that. They're demanding that the students that they hire, not only are they demanding diverse employees, but they want all of the students that they hire from us to have some skills to be able to operate in a diverse world, because they recognize talent comes from all different corners of the globe, but also here in the United States, we have historically excluded talent from underrepresented groups, and especially African-American groups. And so we need, or the employers are recognizing they need to have employees who can work with all different groups and who can build talent pools and productivity among those groups as well.
So thank you all for that great discussion to get things started this morning. I neglected earlier to introduce a couple of other members of our team here. Emma Newell is serving as our moderator, and Beth Flynn, of course, as our host for the conference. Beth and Emma are members of our Leadership Center team, and we're happy to have them here. I'm pointing out that introduction of Emma especially because she is moderating the chat, or monitoring the chat. And we have had a couple of questions that have come up here that I think we're going to jump into those questions from our participants. And if we need to, we can go to those questions that I have planned out ahead of time. So one of the first questions is, what are the panel's thoughts about using the word minority as we think about language in the workplace and conversations about race? Nicole, would you share thoughts? Are there alternatives that are better than using the word minority?
Yeah, that's kind of this dichotomy that we've created, majority, minority, right? And there's kind of been this majority versus minority. And we've really turned to those words to describe different identities, right? We know that the minority is soon going to be the majority, right? We've heard that as well. Language is so powerful. And when we look at the words that we have used, we're really setting up this power imbalance right away with those words, majority and minority. Some other words that I use rather than using minority, and if I do use minority, I kind of say use it that way, right? Because that's what we have historically used. And I always say, this is what we've historically used. Is it the best word? Probably not. Words like underrepresented, marginalized, targeted identities, those are all words that I have used, and I'd be interested in hearing what other panelists use as well.
I'd also like to add, thank you, Nicole, that's very helpful. Context matters too, and I think it's okay and it's very appropriate and instructive at times to talk about racialized minorities, because we're talking about an experience. Now we want to be careful not to cast groups as victims, not to remove their agency, but as our nation's history has been race has been central to our history and the way that power relations have, and also opportunities in life have been distributed. And racializing certain groups has been very much a part of that story. And so understanding that it's not just some kind of natural ordering of different groups, it has been intentional, and some groups have been racialized for, or with purpose, I guess, by those who are more in powerful positions. So I just want to put that out there, that we don't want to lose that part of the story.
Yeah. Leo, did you have a thought you wanted to share on this front too?
I just typed it into chat. I'm participating in there a little bit. I use marginalized because that actually is not dependent on who is the minority or the majority in a given situation. It's all about power, who has the power, who has the privilege. And so that's pretty much so great, thanks Nicole. And targeted is one, target of oppression.
So speaking of oppression, we have another question in the chat. How can we interrogate racism and white supremacy, for that matter, in the workplace? We know those thoughts exist. We know those attitudes are out there. How do we address them?
I do want to offer the Office of Diversity and Inclusion website. It's odi.osu.edu, and I can throw it in the chat. We have a page of many, many resources that we've been collecting across the campus that provide some learning resources and activities. I do encourage units to engage in these learning opportunities, but also to be really thoughtful and planful about how you do it. But there are terrific resources that can help our staff or staff and units to learn, and then to engage in some communication around that learning. And I know Dr. Nieto has lots to say about this.
Thanks, Yolanda. This is an important question, and it's a difficult question, right? I think interrogate racism and white supremacy, right? Were those the words used?
Yes.
Okay, so first it's acknowledging, right, that this is present, and that this is something that needs to be interrogated and questioned, right? What I always turn back to, and I think Whitney, you asked this question, and Whitney's also a student of intergroup dialogue. I always go back to dialogue. How do we create that space to have these conversations? We can't just act like it's not there. And when we do act like it's not there, we're co-signing on it, right? And so it's having the conversations, but then it's also looking at policies, who's in leadership roles, and how does this permeate some of these concepts that we often don't want to talk about? How do they permeate throughout so much that we do as institutions? Because when we're an institution, whether it's a public or a private, we have experienced all this one way or the other, right? We've been complicit, or we've been harmed, and so we've got to get real. We've got to get real with one another, and people are scared to do that. And I think that's what we have to focus on, is how do we make these conversations less scary and give individuals, companies, universities the tools to be able to go there.
I have another question that I'd like to share that came from the chat, that really emphasizes some kind of innate assumptions that many people in the dominant culture in our society tend to often think about. And that question is, I would like to share with the rest of the attendees. So speaking of implicit bias, there are some who assume that African Americans are admitted to OSU with less than qualifications, or that they are not high achieving. And Cliff, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Cliff is a magna cum laude graduate of CFAES. And so, Cliff, if you want to react to this first, or maybe others, rather than a focus on a deficit-based perspective for someone, for a person of color, what can we do to shift to an asset-based framework when welcoming students or coworkers from multivariate backgrounds?
Thank you. I think that's an important point, and I think a couple of the panelists kind of already hit on it, where we kind of have to remove the minority tag and title from it. But that's really a hard thing, especially when you go to a large school that's well known. If I walk around wearing an Ohio State shirt, if I'm jogging around my neighborhood in an Ohio State football shirt, or if I wear a polo, the first question is, well, hey, what'd you play there? Like, didn't play anything. Oh, so you didn't play sports? No. Oh, so you just went there? Yeah. I just went there. Yeah, that's what I did. So, and then the questions you get, what did you go to school for? Well, I'm an engineer. And it's kind of everybody's like, oh, okay. And part of it is, it's like we talked about before, that's the exposure, so there's not a lot of engineers that look like me, at least a lot of people haven't really seen. So then it's being able to see that person, and working at a high school, I might be the only African-American teacher that my students have in their entire life. So it's I think it starts with the exposure to the students and the kids at a young age, so that they think it's normal, because they're used to seeing people look like me dunk basketballs and rap and sing and act, but there's way more that somebody like me can do that doesn't include those things.
Excellent, Cliff. Other thoughts on that question?
I think some of it is about interrogating our value structures too, and understanding that the characteristics or achievements that we value currently come out of the racist systems that we've been living in. And so what's viewed as a deficit is not a deficit, right? Because it's a function of the values that we've always lived with. And so it's about readjusting those values to see the value in diversity.
And that's a great point, Joyce. As a person of privilege in our society, I have recently learned in my own journey that I need to use that privilege. And a lot of times I think it's easy for those of us who are white to really just kind of hide behind the fact or think about what we can do to foster, but really what we need to do is use that position of privilege to make sure these conversations are at the forefront, to make sure that we do shift that perspective and think about those values in the system, Joyce, that you're underscoring. So I really appreciate you sharing that as I stumble around here. So let's shift gears a little bit. And Leo, I'm going to ask you to reply to a question that we kind of had planned out ahead of time. How do you recommend people learn more about the barriers and struggles of a marginalized community?
Oh, that's a great one. Well, I teach in my Power and Privilege workshop about how we tend to surround ourselves by people who are like us. And we live in neighborhoods where people look like us. We involve ourselves in community organizations that look like us. So there's an exercise you can do called examining your network. And I have a spreadsheet that I give out, and it identifies, my supervisor at work is, and then there's numerous columns with different social identity groups. Race is one of those, gender, sexual orientation, religion. But you could think of it as like your top 12. So think about the top 12 people you interact with on a regular basis. And think about what they are in terms of social identity groups, in this case, race. How racially diverse are the people you most commonly and frequently interact with? We learn about people from different social identity groups through the media, very commonly, right? So if we're not having these personal experiences with folks, then we're getting biased information. We need to have personal connections with people. So diversifying your network. Yes, I can share that worksheet with you. Be happy to.
That would be great.
Diversifying your network is a wonderful way for you to start to expand your understanding of diverse people. Now, warning, this is not tokenism. This should not be considered a checklist. Okay, I've got my Black friend, my Chinese friend, my gay friend. Okay, this needs to be genuine, which means how do you, like, it's a challenge. How do you go about doing this? And I've been doing the same thing. I identified how diverse my network is. It's not very diverse. So I don't have a lot of Black friends. At least I don't have a lot of Black friends that I see in person. I have Black Facebook friends. So one of the things that I did was, in my role, in my job, I put on programs. So what I decided to do is put on a program that would lead me to form a relationship with other people who were different from me. So I have I can plug this. I got actually a few programs you might be interested in. This one is a panel event on the intersection of Blackness and queerness. It's happening on October 28th. It's open to all of OSU, and it features 5 Black queer community leaders in Ohio. Most of them are in Columbus. So what this is doing is it is putting me into direct contact with Black folks who I will then create ongoing relationships with, and it will expand my network. So this has to be something that you put some work into. It has to come organically, and it's not about checking those boxes. I'd be happy to share that worksheet with you.
Yeah, please do. Cliff, you also have talked a couple of times about experiences that your own children have had, but you also work with kids every day. What are some of your recommendations of ways that people can learn more about barriers and struggles of people who might be different than them?
I think part of it is, it's just having a conversation, so, in my high school, Naples, Florida, we're about, if I walked out of the door right now to the office, I'd be at the beach in 5 minutes. So not to brag, that might be a little cold this morning, but at the same token, so if you look at the breakdown of our school, there's some kids that live on the beach, they drive $100,000 cars, but there's also some kids that don't have any food at home. And, I think we all in this area, especially in this community, we all kind of get grouped in the same, in the same mold, when that's not the case. When the student parking lot is nicer than our teacher parking lot, but we still have half our kids that can't afford to bring a lunch to school. They don't have breakfast to eat when they come to school every day. So I think that kind of gets overlooked because of how glamorous it is and how nice it is in our area, where everybody just assumes that, everything's okay. But then you take one event that happens and there's like a spark that lights off, that lights everything up. But I think it starts with the conversation, because just like I forget which panelist said it, you surround yourself with people that are like you. So it's a good chance that during lunchtime, you're not sitting with somebody that you don't know. Or when you walk down the hallway, you're not going to talk to somebody that you don't know. So a lot of times the classroom is that one time where you're involuntarily placed in, within a group of people where you have a conversation. Now, that you may want to, as a teacher, you need to have it apply to whatever you're talking about in class. But, when you group kids together and you do it randomly, you can't let them pick, it puts them in a spot where you're with somebody that you may not know. You have to have a conversation with them. So as you keep having those groups, as you work throughout the school year, they start to learn, from one another. So it may be the kid that has the big mansion and the kid that lives in a 2-bedroom apartment with his mom. They may not have ever crossed paths if it wasn't for that, experience in that classroom. But that could be a really good learning experience for both of them, where they can both learn a lot about each other and about their backgrounds.
Thank you, Cliff. And really what you're talking about there is not only learning about one another, but the more we learn about one another, the more we can really exhibit allyship. And so the next question that I have relates to allyship. And Joyce, I'm going to turn to you with this one. How can someone exhibit allyship? If someone were to see, hear, or experience something racist, what would you advise them to do?
I'd say the first step in my book would be to not attempt to justify or excuse the action in some way. I've had that happen several times where, I explain a situation to someone or relate a situation to someone and they say, oh, I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it. When, of course, the person did mean something by it. What he meant by it was, I did not take the time to consider the impact of this action or these words on other people, right? I didn't take the time to educate myself about this scenario. And so that I think is something that's very delegitimizing for people of color to have an experience tried to be explained away like that. So I think that's the first step. And the next thing I'd recommend is to be thoughtful though in your response, right? Because not everybody is going to want a situation called out publicly or even privately, because there is fear of retaliation, and oftentimes there is actual retaliation, right, within these workplace settings. It would be great if we had better channels for sort of documenting these instances and addressing them anonymously. And the last thing I'll mention is just to give folks space to process their own feelings without having to explain it to you, right? Even if you don't understand where the offense came from or what shouldn't have been said, you should take the time to figure that out, right? You can ask for guidance, but it is not the other person's responsibility to explain to you why this was an upsetting situation.
Excellent advice, Joyce. Thank you. Nicole, do you have other thoughts on allyship?
Sure. So when I think of allyship, what I really think of is action. And so many times we're quick to say, oh, I'm an ally, I'm an ally. But how are we truly being an ally? How are we exhibiting allyship in our actions? And that is really key. So if you consider yourself an ally, I would really encourage you to write a list of how you're being an ally. And are you taking important actions towards creating equity in workspaces and other spaces? And if you're not able to write down a few things, then you might need to seek out some ideas on how to really be that ally in action. And a few things that you can do is provide that space. We obviously hear this, providing the space at the table, right? And somebody said recently, and I thought, oh my gosh, and make sure that chair at the table is not a folding chair, right? That can be removed easily. I thought, wow. And I can't remember who to credit with that, but I thought that's powerful, right? This isn't a temporary space that because of everything that's happening, we're going to let you have a seat at the table right now. No, this is a permanent seat at the table. Advocating for others. If we're leaders and we're in leadership roles, how can we be mentors to underrepresented folks, to people of color? How can we nurture those relationships? Where is the intentionality with that? I also read this quote recently, and I want to share this because I think it's so important. As somebody that's in a leadership role, or in a role where people are reaching out to you for insight and advice, or you're making decisions, this line that I read is, make space, don't take it up. And I love that because so many times folks get into these positions of authority and leadership, and they're just, kind of taking up the space, right? But how can you make space, right? Not take up so much space, but make that space that allows other voices and experiences and identities and perspectives to be heard. So that would really be my thoughts around allyship. I want to say one quick thing about how do you interrupt bias in the moment in your workspace. And really what I think is key for that is your voice that you're using and your delivery, right? So you can say something like, I'm just really surprised you said that. What do you mean by it? Right? And that comes off in a different way than, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just said that, right? And when you kind of make sure that you're using this voice that encourages dialogue and doesn't shut down the person who made the remark, then we can really grow from that. And we don't go off into our corners and keep perpetuating this over and over again, but we're able to have that intentionality around a dialogue space. One more quick thing, and this is important depending on where your workspace is, but it's also important to assess your safety in these situations as well. If you feel like you cannot interrupt the bias in the moment because you're not sure how the other person might respond, that is something to consider as well. And you might then reach out to somebody else to help you through that process.
Thanks, Nicole. Yolanda, I'm gonna turn to you next, and I want to ask you a question that is my own question. Nicole talked about making sure that others have a seat at the table and that is a permanent seat, and I couldn't agree more. But I also am wondering, how does one exhibit allyship as one make sure that seat is at the table, but we're not putting pressure on that person who's occupying that seat to represent the perspectives of an entire race? How do we balance that?
Absolutely. That's a terrific question. And it's something I think that we, as especially those of us who are in leadership roles, we need to be asking those kinds of questions throughout our organization. And so I'll actually start with an example that I see often. I see young faculty being hired who they get the job because they have expertise in a certain scholarship area. But then when they arrive in the job, they're told that they're teaching the Race 101 survey because that's where the organization thinks that their utility is, instead of being recognized for the talents and the expertise that they bring. And so this is something that we all need to be mindful of. And as leaders, we can't expect only those who are coming from the groups that we're trying to understand to carry the burden of educating the rest of us. So I pass my kudos on to those who are emphasizing the need for each of us individually to seek out learning opportunities. And that needs to be a habit that we all do, not do once and check the boxes as some indicated. No, it has to be a habit. But as leaders, we need to set the expectation that this is who we are as a unit. So maybe there is no person, maybe we are running a unit that is 100% white and has not had any, and we have a number of those units on our campus for 20 years, haven't had persons of color or others on the staff. That doesn't mean that we don't have a central role to play in promoting, understanding, and advancing the diversity goals. So it's looking at our organization, understanding where we have set barriers and what we can do to remove those barriers to become more diverse, setting expectations that every single member of our staff has a role to play and has performance metrics, a performance evaluation that is going to incorporate those goals. We need to make sure that as leaders, all of our communications are reinforcing an expectation of inclusion and one where all members of the staff will be respected and treat one another with respect. And we can't treat one another with respect if we marginalize or tokenize any members of our staff. So yes, I think we just need to make sure that we're providing expectations and a culture where every member understands the responsibilities that they have, and that we are continuously looking and examining all the things that we do, our policies, our practices, our investments, the way that we shape our work activity, and in terms of our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. So that's absolutely right. We need to do much more to make sure that we are incorporating voices that have not been at the table before, but we can't put the burden on them to carry that whole weight. That responsibility rests with all of us.
Cliff, would you like to weigh in on this particular question as well? I'm sure you have been placed in situations where that has been your experience. And I'm not asking you to talk about something you're not comfortable with, but what advice would you have to make sure we avoid those kinds of situations?
Probably the number one thing is be careful how you react to it, which I think Nicole kind of touched on with how you word it. I mean, obviously, you can't go out and just go nuts with somebody in the middle of a meeting. And I think, a lot of times with all the anger and frustration that we experience overall, that's kind of your first initial thought, so, you have to have a little bit of self-control there. And then kind of, which is a shame to say this, I think it depends on your ranking in your organization and where you are about that, of how you take your next steps. Where I am now, I feel comfortable if I have issues going. I can talk to our principal, to our superintendent if I need to, and feel like my words will be heard, my issues will be addressed, and then I wouldn't have to worry about anything about that. I can't necessarily say that for other places that I've been, other places that I've worked, for the role that I was in. If I would have said anything, would anything would have really happened? So I think you have to assess the situation. Like I said, it's a shame you have to say this, but I mean, just being real. it depends on where you are and how you rank on the totem pole. You know, there's sometimes where you kind of say, okay, I have to address this. I don't know how I'm going to address it, but I have to figure out how. But, you know, avoid the knee-jerk reaction. Make sure you document what happened. You know, especially during an emotional time, you want to make sure you remember exactly what was said and what happened, so that then when you do get the time to address it, you can say exactly what happened. You know, you can give all your details, and then hopefully there'll be some action taken, because what you don't want to do is have an emotional reaction to it, and then what you did then supersedes whatever the other person did, where, you know, everybody ignores that and they just say, okay, well, you did this, so we got to take care of you instead of taking care of what the actual issue is. That would be my advice. I mean, you have to be careful how you handle things. I mean, that's kind of just the world that we live in. And it's different depending on where you live in the country. I mean, I live in a very, very, very conservative area. So, you know, the angry black guy saying something is always going to carry more weight and attention versus the really racist thing that somebody else said. So, you know, you kind of have to be aware of where you are, you know, be aware of who you're around, and then kind of have an idea how you can have things handled and taken care of.
That mute button gets me every time. So Emma, I'm going to turn to you because I know we have several questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that we also touch on as many of those as possible. Which would you suggest we take on next?
Yes, so right now we have 5 questions and about 10 minutes left in our panel. So why don't if I go ahead and ask these questions, and one panelist can address each question, and if you have something that you would like to contribute beyond that, panelist, please feel free to put that in the chat box, being sure that that says to panelists and attendees. So starting off with one of the questions that have not been answered so far, we had someone ask, what suggestions do you have for Black and Brown leaders who begin to have the discussions with a mostly non-Black and Brown workforce who are visibly uncomfortable when the subject arises?
I was looking at you, Yolanda.
Okay, yeah. I was looking to make sure I didn't. So I would say facilitation can be really helpful. If you're a Black or Brown leader and you're leading a team that is mostly white, there's some power issues there, and that could color the way that the staff might hear the message. So I would encourage some facilitation to get some other voices in as well. But I do want to say a word about that. I go into a lot of corners of our campus where they don't have a lot of experience with diversity, and I can see that there are lots of there's a genuine desire to engage these issues, but there's also a lot of fear of saying the wrong thing or making a mistake. I like to share a lot about my own experience and the different ways that. So I'm Latina. I grew up in South Texas. And there are many different words that Latinas are using to describe themselves these days, and people feel very passionately and strongly to the words that they choose to use to identify. And I share that because the point is that I'm one perspective and there's not one right perspective. So I think what's really, really important, and I want to go back to this, creating cultures where everybody understands the value that they're bringing to the organization, and they understand the expectations that they carry as a member of that organization. And if you can create a safe culture, that can be helpful for all kinds of inclusion and moving forward in that regard.
And then, if I can add something real quick, I was in that position. I ran my first job site, my first project on my own. I think I was 26 years old. So 26-year-old Black kid from Northeast Ohio in South Florida with a crew of about 30 or 40. You know, you got guys from the Southeast, guys from South Florida. And then I had a bunch of drillers from the middle of Oklahoma that came over. So you can imagine that's kind of I wouldn't say difficult, I would say different, but really how I started was, it's just, it's a relationship. So it's not, I talk to them just like I talk to anybody else. I treat them just like I treat anybody else. And what I like to do is I let my qualifications speak for themselves where, you know, I did my job every day. I make sure that they were okay. I make sure they did their jobs. And it was never, oh, because I'm Black, I'm going to say this, or because you're white, I'm going to talk to you this way. I treat them the same, you know, as I would treat anybody else. And as that, you know, as a relationship forms, whenever you have to have a conversation about something, I believe it's easier when you talk to them before about anything, you know, which is interesting to say because as a classroom teacher, there might be some students you never talk to. There may be some people at work that you never talk to. So all of a sudden, when something happens and you got to talk to them, where it's gonna be awkward anyway. So really, the most conversation about something maybe outside of work or something that may be difficult, at least you guys already have a relationship. I wouldn't say necessarily a bond, but you have a relationship to where if you need to talk about or discuss something, that's not the first time you actually had a conversation about anything at all.
Excellent point. All of this begins with relationships, doesn't it? Emma, what's the next question from the chat?
Yes, thank you, Yolanda and Cliff. Our next question is, how does an employer ensure that a person is there based on talent and contribution as opposed to simply checking a diversity box?
I think probably the best way to do that is to let that person demonstrate their capabilities. So, you know, whatever they're hired for, allow them to do their job and allow them to maybe do their job on a pretty large platform so that everyone else understands that, hey, this person knows what they're doing, and they, you know, and they know what they're talking about. I've been able to speak at many national conventions all over the place. I spent some time in Indianapolis for the last few very, very cold Februarys where we have a summit where all of our engineering teachers will come and, you know, and we'll speak. And it's interesting to see the reaction you get when you first walk into the room, where they're like, oh, what's this guy going to talk about? But then you give it a couple minutes and they say, oh, well, this is actually very helpful, or this person knows what they're doing. That I think will take all that, you know, all that stuff away. So whether it be a presentation or a training or whatever it will be, where, you know, you can give that person a little bit of time to shine in the spotlight, I think that would kind of get rid of some of that bias and some of those kind of back channel conversations that might occur when that happens.
I think it's important for us to differentiate privilege and merit as well, right? A lot of what we attribute to merit is actually privilege, right? Some of what we talked about regarding networks, right, that people associate with others like them means that those who don't look like me, right, or if I don't look like everybody else, I get fewer chances to be a speaker or go on a panel or whatever. And that's not a merit issue, it's a privilege issue. And so I think it's important that we call them out as two different things when, especially coming back to this idea of a deficit, right, that it's not a deficit, it's a privilege issue.
Thank you. Emma, what's the next question?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the participants that are asking these questions and making themselves vulnerable when maybe we're not so comfortable and we don't know how to phrase things. So thank you, panelists, or thank you, participants, for doing that. Our next question says, how do we prioritize our diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to positioning with our partners, for example, ag funders within CFAES?
Leo, you want to take that one?
Sorry, I was typing up a response to something. So could somebody else?
I'm sorry. Anyone else want to respond to that question?
Well, one thing I'm hopeful to see in the near future is that more units and universities and companies will really embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion as a core value. I feel like in a lot of contexts still it's treated as an ancillary thing, right? It's the other piece that we have. It's not a core value the way customer service is or efficiency is or any of those things, right? So, and I think that's how we bring about change is, as you mentioned, right, creating that culture where employees all recognize from the top all the way down that this is part of how we operate. This is something that we value and you need to contribute to it.
Thank you, Joyce. And I regret that we are out of time, and this is a conversation that could go on forever, and it needs to. And the wonderful thing about all of this involvement that we've had today is that we're seeing how important this is to so many, and it needs to be an ongoing conversation for all of us. So earlier today, I got to watch the World Food Prize being presented to Dr. Ratan Lal, a soil scientist at Ohio State University. And watching that, watching a gentleman who grew up impoverished in India and Pakistan rising to a world stage the way he did is a way to underscore to me that what an individual does really matters. And I think that's something that's so pertinent to the conversation we're having today. The role of the individual, the willingness to become vulnerable, the acknowledgement of the need for the conversation. That's where change happens. It happens, as Cliff said, with relationships that we form. It doesn't begin at the organizational level, it begins at the individual level. And we all need to remember that and continue to learn and grow. Beth, do you have final thoughts from your point of view?
Yes, thank you to our panelists for your excellent information. I think this was a very productive conversation, and thank you for everybody who participated today. And so this concludes our session, and we will be making this presentation available via a YouTube link later today, along with other resources. So ask the panelists to share their websites and any upcoming trainings so that you will have that also for your information. And of course, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn to learn more information. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.